pray about. So on the second Sunday of Lent, right, we continue the journey, right, towards the Easter Triduum and this weirdest of years. And last week, step back with me for a moment, right, 7 days. You'll recall perhaps last weekend as Father Chaz preached all the Masses last weekend, he spoke a lot about prayer, right, in the context of the whole Lenten season, that every year when we come around again, we seem to have this recurring invitation about intentional living. And specifically in the season of Lent, we're asked to think about, right, God comes to us and asks us for sort of a little bit deeper investment in three particular ways, right, in the way of prayer and fasting and almsgiving. We know that as kind of part of our Christian vocabulary, don't we? Or from our Sunday school and from everything in between. And every Lent, of course, we come back around. And so last week, as Father Chaz preached about prayer, we thought that, well, obviously this week, let's preach about fasting. And so that's what I'm going to do for us today, preach about fasting. I actually find it a good opportunity to preach about fasting, especially in the context of the gospel we hear, the gospel of the Transfiguration. Father Brian, that doesn't make any sense. Follow me. Just hold on for a second. You know, we listen to the story of Transfiguration. We're like, what the heck does that have to do with fasting? Fasting is one of those interesting things anyways. It's one of those peculiarly Christian and Catholic things that we do every Lent, and it kind of sets us apart in a visible way, right, that other people notice. And sometimes you get lots of commentary about this. You know, like, that's right, you can't eat meat. You have to eat fish on Fridays, don't you? Oh, it stinks to be you. Or like, oh yeah, and you get those ashes on that Wednesday. And, you know, we have these sort of more exteriorly seen things out there in the world that make a kind of label for us. And sometimes you get made fun of for that, or you get noticed for that. And, you know, it tends to reinforce a lot of the conceptions the world already has about Christians, which is like, well, the only thing you believe in is a God who doesn't want you to have any of the good things, and you're just kind of pain and suffering, and you just do a little bit more of it during Lent, don't you? Think you're all better, right? And people might not say that, but that's certainly out there, right? Certainly out there in the world. The world has its own kind of funny view about this whole topic of fasting. And when we talk about fasting, what's the first thing that we're really speaking about, right? Most directly, we speak about those simple goods that are part of the necessity of sort of the human race. So in a very specific way, when we talk about fasting, usually and firstly, we're talking about what involves food and drink, what involves sleep and rest, and what involves simple pleasures and sex. These things. We have very strong desires for these things. Why? Because if we don't fulfill these things, we die, or the human species ceases to exist. Right? These are very basic, surface level, necessarily good things that God gives us for our benefit, right? For our good. And so the world will look at these things, and it's part of the human experience, and they'll usually go one of two ways with those goods. You have the first camp, right, that kind of sits over here and that looks at those good things and they said, you want to know what? Those things are good. And in fact, those things are great. And in fact, those things are what make life happy. And in order for us to be happy, what we ought to do is to acquire those goods for ourselves to the maximal degree, as much as we can. There's this sort of taking of what is good and just like pouring all the salt on it and all the sugar on it and just like ice cream and everything, right? Because that's in fact the only thing there is in the world and in our lives, right? Is all these sort of things that we just can kind of acquire for ourselves. And that's one direction, right? In the very sort of far end of that spectrum, you get finally to the place of addiction, where someone has too much, right, of a good thing or of a seemingly good thing, to the point that we're no longer able to control or discipline our need for it and regulate it. So that's one camp. But then there's this other camp, right? Some of the world goes in this other direction as well. And what this side goes to is it looks at all of those good things, right, that we mentioned, those simple goods of the human experience, and it says about them, no, in fact, those are not actually good things. They're bad for us, and so we shouldn't do them. We need to abstain from them always. Those people say, I don't need those. I'm better than those things. I'm going to be over here to just kind of grit it out because I can, because I'm stronger than them. They don't need to be part of my life. We call those kind of people stoic, don't we, right? You've heard that sort of adjective before. Someone who is stoic is kind of like the one who stands straight and erect like a statue. And there's nothing that affects them one way or the other. And they're just a master over all things. And no matter what it is, they can grin and bear it. And so this camp looks at the good, simple goods of human experience, and it rejects them altogether. Right? And it calls them bad or evil or unnecessary or less than us. And we're better than that. So we need to sort of move away from it. And as Christians, we sit in neither of these places, neither in this place of recognizing the good for what it is, but then using it towards ourselves to kind of implode in, nor in this place over here that says, no, what is good is evil, and so I'm going to reject it and avoid it. As Christians, we sit in the middle and we see the good for what it is, even these simple, sort of basic surface level goods, and as Christians, we use them not to implode or to reject, but to point us to our true end, which is an end, of course, beyond these simple goods. Good as they are, they don't exhaust the human experience. And so in the Lenten season, when we come to fasting, we're talking about how it is that we live with these simple goods, and especially how we intentionally, we'll say, moderate or sacrifice them in a small way. Do we do that just because we love a little bit more pain? Of course not. We don't. Because you see what happens when we moderate those surface level goods, when we sort of, in some ways, part ways between them or set them aside. What happens is we dig underneath to deeper desires that then are awakened. Fuller experiences of the human person and the meaning of human life that also need searching and fulfilling. And so when we fast from what is at the surface, we awaken what is underneath. We do that here, right? That is the meaning of fasting during the season of Lent, because what fasting does is that it awakens deeper desires. Now, in fact, I can say this and it sounds kind of cool and nice and whatever, but say more. Okay, I'll say more. I'm going to give you an example of how this is part of your life. This is actually more common to us than we might necessarily recognize. I'm going to tell you a story about one of my at least common enough experiences of life that I've said in various ways before in homilies. And it's about the time when I was 16. It was the first time that I ever went hunting. Most of you know that in my family, I was not a hunter growing up. My dad did not do that, but his brother, my uncle, did. And my uncle used to take his 3 sons, my 3 cousins, out hunting, and they did that from the time that they were kids, but I didn't do that. But I went out with them one time when I was 16 for the first time. And any of you out here who are hunters, either from the time that you're kids or maybe later on in life, you're going to know exactly the story that I'm going to tell. Because after I went hunting that first time, man, I was like hooked. I was like, this is awesome. There's something so unique and unusual about this. Something that seems so special and worthy and awesome about being able to kind of be one with nature and enjoy the gift of God's creation and be still, right? And have these experiences of kind of being closer to the ground, closer to the earth. And I don't know, there's something in it that makes you alive. And I made a decision after that first time that this is what I wanted to continue doing. Now, of course, like I said, I wasn't a hunter. And so when you get into the world of hunting, there's all kinds of stuff, isn't there? All kinds of gear, right? We all know how it goes, but I didn't have any of it. The only way I could ever go hunting is if I went with them. And that's what I decided to do. So every year thereafter, from the time I was 16 probably till I was about 22 or 23, every November, I found my way out to Kalamazoo where they lived every year in the second half of November to take a weekend to go hunting with my uncle and my cousins. And it was the same every time. You know how this goes if you've been there. There's just a lot of kind of excitement and anticipation that begins to build, right? I'm driving out, I get there, you get there in the evening, the day before you hunt. We know the next morning that we're going to be out first thing in the morning, we're going to come back after the morning hunt, we're going to take a break, eat some lunch, then we're going to go out in the early afternoon and have the evening hunt. Now, the way that this works is when you get there the night before, of course, you're already starting to prepare. People got the clothes out, right? We got the maps out. We're already starting to talk about, like, where we're going to be. All right, last year, remember, we're going to be at this property. You're going to be up on the ridge line. There's a tree stand up there. I'm going to be down in the field, right? And John's going to be over in the bush. You have to take the trail halfway back and look for this marker. You remember that from last year? Man, 3 years ago, we had this great 8-point buck that came right by there. We might be getting something big tomorrow, right? And so then the stories start going. And when everyone tells hunting stories, they just go on and on and on, don't they? Now, here's the thing about hunting early in the morning. When you get out first thing in the morning, you have to be out before sunrise. You can start hunting 30 minutes before sunrise, so you have to be out there even earlier, 45 minutes to an hour before sunup. Now, where we hunted with my uncle and my cousins was about 45 minutes away from where they lived. We went all the way out to the West Coast into South Haven. So we had to be up even earlier to get to hunting on time. We had to be up at 3:45 in the morning for a morning hunt. That's early. So what would conventional wisdom tell you about a situation such as this? When you know that you have to get up early, what should you do? You should go to bed early. Now ask me if I ever went to bed early. Never went to bed early. In fact, we went to bed later because that's what you do, right? There's just the anticipation and the excitement of it. You got to plan, you got to scheme. People tell stories. It's like 11 o'clock, man, we should probably go to bed. It's like 11:30, man, we really got to get to bed. It's quarter to midnight. Okay, we got to shut it down. So you're sliding into bed just before midnight. And then you lay down and you get into bed and you pull the covers over, and what happens next? You just lay there. Man, you don't get any sleep that night. I never got sleep. I might have winked on and off, you try to nap, but there's just too much anticipation. Sure enough, the alarm clock goes off 3:45 in the morning. I just like, you're groggy. You're like, what is it? Where am I even? But you get up and then the ritual starts, right? Now, when I was growing up, I never drank coffee, ever. My dad did, but I hated the taste of it, except one day a year, and that was the day I went hunting. It was part of the ritual, right? My uncle got up, 2 big pots of coffee. First big pot of coffee, we drink while we were getting ready. Second big pot of coffee, you'd put in these big special thermoses. Those things kept at piping hot lava temperature for the next 18 hours. I don't know how it happened. You'd throw those things in the back of the pickup truck. You'd come back from your morning hunt, and they would still be too hot to drink, right? And then, of course, we went down into the basement. The little hunting prep room was down in the basement. It's freezing down there, by the way, right? Because it's winter anyways. I don't have any of my gear, so I'm wearing my uncle's stuff. It's kind of too big for me, but whatever. It's awesome. So you pull on your wool socks, freezing. You pull on your long johns, freezing, right? So you're just shivering. You get your layers on, and then you start to warm up. But you got to be careful because you can't get too hot. Because if you get too hot, you start to sweat. And when you hunt, sweating is bad. Don't sweat when you hunt, especially in the early mornings, because it's cold. And if you get out there and you start sweating before you hunt, by the time you sit in for half an hour, that sweat has started to make you shiver, and you're just going to have a miserable time for the next 4 hours that morning. Right? So here we are, right? We're getting ourselves ready. We're packing up everything in the back of the pickup truck. We're sitting 3 wide on the bench seat in the front. The other 2s are just smashed in the back. You got all kinds of layers on. Everyone's just kind of packed in. And then we get on the road, get on the highway 40 minutes, and all you're listening to is the wind that sort of rushes by. And the whole time, the last thing I'm thinking about is how tired I am. That's not even on your mind. It's like all the adrenaline is going in that moment. And in that, and I wouldn't be able to describe it for you, but all of you who've ever had that moment know exactly how it feels. Because you know that you're in this place that's just like unique, one of a kind, special. All the world is asleep, but here you are, the only person on the road, and you're here with your uncle and your cousins, and you're going out to do something awesome. And you're going to be together in this place of fraternity and camaraderie, and you're going to be able to sit in the stillness of nature and watch the sunrise and watch all of the animals wake up, and you're up before they are. And if you're really lucky, you might just have something come by. Now, in an experience like that in life, whether you're a boy or whether you're grown or whether it's hunting or whether it's something else, in those places of great expectation, there's something that naturally occurs, which is you can't sleep. Now, I'll tell you what, every other day of the year, I love sleep. Love it. Love my sleep. Not on that night. Why? Because something deeper is happening on that night. Something more important is unfolding. Something more worthy of human experience, right? This kind of communion and fraternity is about to occur. And when that moment arrives, your surface level desires kind of quite naturally suppress themselves. Where your body's like, I don't need to be asleep right now. Something more important is going on. Right? We all know this experience. Think about something else, right? What all of you husbands and wives out there, right? Think about the morning of your wedding. By a raising of your hand, how many of you had a big, bold bacon cheeseburger the morning before your wedding? That would be nobody. Because what was the last thing you wanted to do before you got married? Eat. Now, you and I love eating just as much as each other any other day of the year, but on that day, in that moment, something better, something more important, something deeper, something more significant was happening. And so you had these natural surface level desires that just kind of parted ways with you for that moment because something more needed to be fulfilled in you. We didn't know it, what we were fasting from in that moment, but it was just happening all on its own. And this occurs in our lives often, more often than we think. This experience of fasting. And when it happens to us, right, it can happen in those great moments, right, in those beautiful moments, but it also happens, right, in those difficult moments, not of anticipation, but of trepidation, right? Ever been in a place of real pain and sorrow and suffering? What was the last thing you wanted to do in that moment? Eat. All right? You come in and to church for a funeral, and if that funeral was for someone that you loved, you probably didn't have breakfast that morning, did you? Because something deeper, something more significant, something more holy and sacred was occurring in that time. And it just kind of naturally occurred that you knew it, and that's how it unfolded. And in the season of Lent, right, what's happening to us is not only are we acknowledging that this is a natural part of human experience that occurs on its own, but we also are asked by God to say, you want to know what? Sometimes in life, we can't just let that happen. We have to intend that experience. Now, I'm not talking about intending the circumstances per se, but I'm talking about intending the regulation of those surface level desires so that something deeper can awaken. Sometimes we have to choose that for the sake of the life that we're meant to live. I'll give in another example, a little more difficult of an example. I remember, I think it was the first year that I was a priest here at St. John's, and I remember the day that the call came down to the office from the hospital saying that someone in the family needed a priest because there was a mom and a dad who gave birth to a stillborn baby. And at that moment in my life, I had never seen a deceased infant ever. I mean, I just had never laid eyes on one. Lots of moms and dads out there, right? In our family, in our own St. John's family, have lived through this kind of moment. It's very, very hard. It's very hard. As a priest, I've walked with some. And I'll tell you what, right, on the one hand, don't get me wrong, you get a call like that, and as a priest, you're like, that's exactly where I need to be, and I know it, and something important is going to happen there. And I wanted that. It's part of what God made me for in my life. But let's not joke around. That was extraordinarily uncomfortable. On a natural level, that was the last place I wanted to be, because who wants, on a natural level, like, who wants to step outside of the door of comfort and walk into a situation like that? It's not ordinary. But God gave me, right, a moment, and he asked me, you got to step through that door entitled uncomfort, discomfort, and you got to walk there. You got to get through the surface into something deeper because it's more important and it's happening, and the grace of Jesus needs to be there right now. And so you do it. And of course, right, this is all happening in the moment. Mom and dad had just birthed their baby, and the baby, I didn't have really many details other than the baby didn't make it. And it was particularly difficult because many, right, among us have dealt with miscarriage on one level or another, and that's hard. This was a full-term child. 38 or 39 weeks. And so I drive down, right, to Henry Ford, and I've been to the hospital many times before that with anointings, and hospital visits, and on that day, wouldn't you know it, every parking spot in that lot was full. Everyone. Now, I'd seen that lot full, I'd seen that lot empty, I'd seen that lot, everything in between, but I tell you what, I was like, of all the times, why has it got to be this time? There's something important I got to be at. And so I drove around, and finally, I found the singular empty parking spot in that whole lot. And you want to know how I knew it was the last open spot? Because here was the spot, and here was the car next to it, and on the other side, here was the car next to it as well. I mean, there wasn't even a spot to park, hardly. I was like, can I even get my car in here? But I got to go. And so I backed in, right, and I just tried to gingerly maneuver my way out, and you have to, like, you ever had that where you literally have to shimmy out your door because there was about 12 inches on my left and 12 inches on my right. I felt horrible. You know, I kind of walked away, and I looked, and I said, these people must think that I'm the biggest jerk because they can't even get into their vehicles. I hope they don't come back while I'm here. But I walked into the hospital and went up to the third floor intensive care unit, and down the hall from that unit, there's a little room that they've made into a chapel for people to pray, and that's where I met the family that day. I walked into that chapel, and Mom and Dad, members of the family, were there, and just there in the middle, at the front, in his little incubator bed, was this perfect baby boy. 10 fingers, 10 toes. Looked like he was peacefully sleeping. And I have no idea, right? Who knows? Who of us knows what to say in a moment such as that? There are no words, and I didn't have any. But what I did have is my little prayer book with me, and so I opened that prayer book for circumstances such as those, and I just began to pray the words in that book, which is what you do when you don't have anything else to say. And it was a really important, deep, sacred moment of grieving, of deep significance, right, for this particular family. And they were glad in that moment, right, to have a priest to come and to pray with them. And I was blessed to be able to take holy water and bless the body of that baby boy. And I had all the members of the family take some holy water and bless his body as well. And we just sat and we prayed and we talked. And I might have been there for half an hour or an hour. And at a certain point, you just kind of judge, you just kind of gracefully back away. And I thanked the family just for the opportunity of that moment, right, to be with them, that I could enter into something so significant. And I walked out of that chapel and walked down the hall, and I was full of adrenaline. But I also sensed very deeply in my heart in that moment that the approval, right, of God the Father was with me in a very peaceful way. And he said, thank you for walking through that door called discomfort so that you could go beneath the surface to be in a deeper place of significance that needs grace. And I was just trying to, right, abide in that peace as I walked back to the car. And I got back to my car, and sure enough, the whole parking lot was still full except for the spot next to my car. And I looked down at my car, and there it was, right on the side, a nice little dent right in the door. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but my first thought was this: golly, Lord, after all this hard moment, and then after this super difficult thing, all I get is a dented door. What a stupid thing to think, huh? But I got past that. And in fact, I began to be proud of that little dent in my door. It's not too big, but I notice it every time I walk into my door, because it reminds me of what happened on that day and how much God's grace needed to be in that moment for people who were going through much deeper things than what happens on the surface. And this is exactly, right, how those deeper desires unfold. When we go into those places, God marks them in permanent ways, right? He gives us these reminders, and he says, remember that. You remember that? That's right. And so the Lenten season, right, we see this, right, in our experience when God invites us to fast. He says, you want to know what? From the best of times to the worst of times and everything in between, you know what fasting is about. It happens in your life. And sometimes I ask you, because I love you, to examine those surface level things again and to part ways with them in some fashion, because deeper things in you need to arise. Not because these surface level goods aren't good, but because there's more to us, and God knows it. God asks us to walk into that deeper, fuller life that only we can choose if we choose it. It's open to us. And if you and I understand that, and if we have an experience of some kind like that, and if any one of my words is like, oh, I know what that's about, well, then you know exactly what the meaning of the Transfiguration is. Because that's the best way I know how to describe Transfiguration. Right? You just heard a gospel story that's written on your heart every time this occurs in your life. Whether it happens naturally or whether you choose it intentionally. 99 days out of 100, those apostles walked with Jesus and they looked him in the eyes and they saw a man in the flesh, but not that day. Right on that day, they looked upon Jesus and something deeper than the surface was unveiled before them. Something more important, something more majestic, something more meaningful, something more lasting, something more eternal. The glory of God was unveiled to them. Because God knows, I look at you, my sons, my daughters, and I know the good things that you need, and I come to invite you into them. And I unveil beneath the surface the fuller realities of human life so that you may live in those places, not simply always on the surface. And in Lent, that's exactly what we choose. We look at a story like the Transfiguration and we say, that's not just about Jesus, it's about me. And it's about my ability to cooperate and intend a deeper, more fulfilling, fuller life for myself. The life that God has chosen for me to live and desires for me to live. Nothing less than my own transfiguration.